Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds what he's really meant to do. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to discover the one place that feels like home. That's what happened to Jed Cavanaugh, a homeless drifter who wandered into Cedar Falls with nothing but the clothes on his back and a lifetime of regrets. Past Widow's Creek sat an old abandoned farm that nobody remembered or cared about. The barn was falling down. Weeds had taken over the fields. The farmhouse looked like a ghost. But when Jed saw that place, something stirred in him. He picked up a rusty shovel and started working. Day after day, he cleared the land with his bare hands. The townspeople thought he was crazy. But months later, what Jed built on that forgotten farm changed everything. What secret was he hiding that made this broken-down land so important to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Cedar Falls like an old man's memories, refusing to let go even as the sun climbed higher over the pine-covered hills. Main Street stretched exactly 4 blocks, lined with buildings that had seen better decades. Morrison's General Store, with its faded red paint, the Copper Kettle Diner, where the coffee was always too strong and the pie always too sweet, and Harlan's Feed and Seed, where dust motes danced in shafts of golden light streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned since Carter was president. Jed Cavanaugh had been walking these mountains for 3 weeks, following deer trails and old logging roads that most folks had forgotten existed. His beard was streaked with grey and tangled with burrs, his canvas coat patched in a dozen places with whatever fabric he could scavenge. The soles of his boots were held together with wire and hope, but his steps were steady. A man learned to walk light when he carried everything he owned in a torn duffel bag that had seen better wars. He'd come down from the high country because winter was breathing down his neck, and even a man who'd learned to live rough needed shelter when the snow started falling in earnest. 3 winters he'd spent in these mountains, moving from one abandoned cabin to another, living off what the land provided and what little he could earn, doing odd jobs for ranchers who didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. The townspeople noticed him the moment he stepped onto Main Street. In a place like Cedar Falls, where everybody knew everybody else's business going back 3 generations, a stranger stood out like a sore thumb. Mrs. Abernathy peered at him through the lace curtains of her Victorian boarding house, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his weathered appearance. Tom Morrison paused in stacking canned goods to watch through his store window. Even old Doc Henley, sitting on his usual bench outside the post office with his morning paper and thermos of coffee, looked up from the sports section to study the newcomer. But it was Sarah Chen who spoke to him first. She was loading bags of dog food into the back of her pickup truck when Jed walked past, and something in his careful, respectful way of nodding to her made her pause. "Morning," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as one of the newer residents she'd moved to Cedar Falls 5 years ago to take over the veterinary practice when old Doc Peterson finally retired. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee and maybe a decent meal." Jed stopped, his grey eyes meeting hers with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "That's kind of you, ma'am, but I don't have much in the way of payment right now." "Who said anything about payment?" Sarah smiled, and it transformed her whole face. She was maybe 40, with laugh lines that spoke of a woman who'd learned to find joy in small things, and calloused hands that told the story of hard work honestly done. "I'm Sarah Chen, the local vet. You look like a man who's been walking a long road." "Jed Cavanaugh," he replied, touching the brim of his worn baseball cap. "And yes, ma'am, it's been a long road indeed." "Well, Mr. Cavanaugh, the copper kettle serves a breakfast that'll stick to your ribs, and Martha always makes too much coffee anyway. Come on, I'll buy you a meal, and you can tell me where you're headed." The diner was exactly what Jed expected: red vinyl booths, a counter with chrome stools, and the smell of bacon, grease, and coffee that had been building up for decades. Martha Kowalski, a sturdy woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair pinned back in a practical bun, looked up from the grill when they walked in. Her eyes sharpened when she saw Jed, but Sarah's presence seemed to ease whatever concerns she might have had. "Sarah, honey, you're early today," Martha said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And who's your friend?" "Martha, this is Jed Cavanaugh. He could use some of that famous breakfast of yours." Martha's expression softened slightly. She'd been feeding hungry people for 30 years, and she recognized need when she saw it. "Take that booth by the window," she told them. "Coffee's fresh, and I've got eggs, bacon, and hash browns that'll set you right up." As they settled into the booth, Sarah studied Jed's face in the better light. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into mountain distances, and a set to his jaw that suggested a man who'd learned to endure. But there was something else too, a gentleness in the way he handled the coffee cup Martha brought over, a carefulness that spoke of someone who understood the value of simple kindness. "So where are you headed, Mr. Cavanaugh?" Sarah asked, wrapping her hands around her own mug. Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the morning activity on Main Street. A school bus rumbled past, carrying children to the consolidated school 20 miles down the highway. An old man walked his dog past the hardware store. Life moved at the pace it always had in places like Cedar Falls, where change came slowly and was often resisted. "Well," Jed said finally, "I was thinking I might stay around here for the winter. Maybe find some work, earn enough to keep body and soul together until spring." "What kind of work do you do?" "Whatever needs doing. I can fix most anything that's broken, work with my hands. Grew up on a farm, so I know my way around livestock and machinery." He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Been a while since I had a regular job, though. Most folks prefer to hire someone with references and a permanent address." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Cedar Falls isn't most places. We tend to judge people by what they do, not where they come from. And with winter coming, there's always work for a man who's handy. Tom Morrison's been looking for someone to help him reorganize his stockroom, and I know for a fact that old Henderson's been putting off fixing his barn roof until he could find someone foolish enough to climb up there." Martha arrived with plates loaded with food, eggs over easy, crispy bacon, hash browns golden brown and steaming, and thick slices of toast made from bread she baked herself. Jed looked at the feast in front of him with something approaching reverence. "Ma'am, this is more food than I've seen on one plate in months," he said quietly. "Then you'd better eat up," Martha replied, but her voice was gentler now. "And don't you worry about paying. Sarah's got a tab here that goes back to when she first arrived, and I figure feeding a hungry man falls under community service." As Jed ate, Sarah found herself genuinely curious about this quiet stranger. There was something in his manner that suggested education and experience beyond what his rough appearance might indicate. He held his fork properly, said please and thank you without thinking about it. And when he spoke, his grammar was correct, despite the mountain drawl that colored his words. "You mentioned you grew up on a farm," she said, "around here." "Not exactly," Jed replied carefully, "but close enough. Mountain country all looks pretty much the same after a while. Good land, hard-working people, long winters." Sarah sensed there was more to that story, but she also recognized a man's right to keep his past to himself. Instead, she changed the subject. "Well, if you're serious about staying for the winter, you'll need a place to bunk. Mrs. Abernathy runs the boarding house, but I'll warn you, she's got rules about everything, from when you can take a bath to what time the front door gets locked at night." "I appreciate the warning, ma'am, but I'm used to sleeping rough. Got a good sleeping bag and a tarp. Just need someplace out of the wind and weather." "Nonsense," Sarah said firmly. "No man should have to sleep outside when winter's coming. Let me ask around, see what's available. There's always somebody who needs a caretaker or a handyman who'd be willing to provide room and board in exchange for work." As if summoned by their conversation, The diner door chimed, and Tom Morrison walked in, nodding to Martha and sliding onto a stool at the counter. He was a lean man in his 50s, with thinning hair and the permanent tan of someone who spent his days moving between indoor and outdoor work. "Tom," Sarah called out, "come over here a minute. I want you to meet someone." Tom approached their booth with curiosity written on his weathered face. "Sarah, how are you this morning? And who might this be?" "Tom Morrison, meet Jed Cavanaugh. He's looking for work and a place to stay for the winter." Tom's handshake was firm, his assessment quick but not unfriendly. "What kind of work are you looking for, Mr. Cavanaugh?" "Whatever needs doing," Jed replied. "I can handle tools, work with my hands. Not afraid of hard work or long hours." "Well, I could use some help around the store," Tom said slowly. "Got a storage room that's been needing organizing for about 5 years, and my back isn't what it used to be for moving heavy stock around. Pay wouldn't be much, but it's honest work. I'd appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Morrison." "Tom," the store owner corrected. "And tell you what, why don't you come by the store after you finish breakfast? I'll show you around, and we can work out the details." After Tom left, Sarah finished her coffee and prepared to head to her clinic. "I've got to get going," she said, standing and pulling on her jacket. "Got a mare to check on at the Henderson place, and knowing Henderson, he'll want to discuss that roof repair work while I'm there." "Thank you," Jed said, and the sincerity in his voice made her pause. For the breakfast, the introductions, the kindness. It's been a while since I've met people willing to help a stranger. "Cedar Falls takes care of its own," Sarah replied, "and something tells me you'll fit right in." As Sarah left the diner, Jed finished his breakfast slowly, savoring each bite and the warmth of the coffee. Through the window, he could see the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already touched with snow. Somewhere up there were the caves and abandoned cabins where he'd spent the last 3 years, hiding from a world that had become too complicated and painful to navigate. But maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to see if a man could find peace in the simple rhythm of honest work and quiet community. Maybe Cedar Falls could be the place where Jed Cavanaugh finally stopped being a ghost and started being human again. The bell over the diner door chimed as he stood to leave, and Martha called out from behind the counter, "You come back any time, young man, and don't be a stranger." Young man! He hadn't been called that in years, and it brought an unexpected warmth to his chest. As he stepped out onto Main Street, Jed felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, growing like the first green shoots of spring after a long, hard winter. He walked toward Morrison's general store with purpose in his step, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder and the morning sun warming his back. Behind him, the mountains watched silently, keeping their secrets. Ahead of him, the town of Cedar Falls waited to see what this quiet stranger might bring to their community. Jed Cavanaugh was ready to find out. 3 weeks had passed since Jed started working at Morrison's general store, and he'd settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Tom had been true to his word about the work, organizing inventory, moving stock, helping customers find what they needed, and the pay, while modest, was enough to cover a small room above the hardware store next door and simple meals at the Copper Kettle. For the first time in years, Jed was sleeping in an actual bed and eating regular meals. The townspeople had gradually warmed to his quiet presence. He spoke when spoken to, worked without complaint, and carried himself with a respectful dignity that won over even the most skeptical residents. Mrs. Abernathy had stopped pursing her lips when she saw him on the street, and young Billy Henderson had taken to following him around the store, fascinated by the way Jed could identify any tool or piece of hardware just by looking at it. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. Jed was restocking the farming supplies section, arranging bags of feed and seed with the methodical precision that had become his trademark, when Sarah Chen burst through the store's front door, Her usual calm composure was gone, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Tom," she called out, her voice tight with urgency. "Tom, where are you?" Tom Morrison emerged from behind the counter, concern immediately creasing his features when he saw Sarah's expression. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's the Mackenzie farm," she said, struggling to catch her breath. "The old place past Widow's Creek. There's someone there, Tom. Someone's been living there, working the land." Jed's hands stilled on the bag of chicken feed he'd been lifting. The blood in his veins seemed to slow to a crawl, and for a moment the familiar sounds of the store, the creak of old floorboards, the hum of the refrigerated cases, the distant tick of the wall clock faded to nothing. "That's impossible," Tom said, shaking his head. "That place has been abandoned for 15 years, ever since." He stopped himself, glancing around the store as if remembering they weren't alone. "Since what, Tom?" Sarah pressed. "I've been here 5 years, and I've never heard the whole story. All anyone ever says is that something terrible happened out there." Tom's expression grew guarded, the way it always did, when the conversation touched on certain subjects that Cedar Falls preferred to keep buried. "It's not important now. What matters is what you saw." "Are you sure someone's there?" "I'm sure," Sarah said emphatically. "I was checking on the Hendersons' sick calf this morning, and I took the long way back because it was such a beautiful day. When I drove past the creek, I could see smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney. Real smoke, Tom, not just morning mist. And the fields, someone's been clearing them. There are furrows in the ground, like someone's been preparing to plant." Jed forced himself to continue working, but every word of their conversation hit him like a physical blow. The Mackenzie farm. He should have known that name would surface eventually, should have realized that his past would catch up with him the moment he decided to stay in one place long enough for people to notice. "Maybe it's just squatters," Tom suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. "Drifters looking for shelter. It happens sometimes with abandoned properties." "No," Sarah said firmly, "this wasn't random. Whoever's there knows what they're doing. I could see tool marks on the trees that have been cut back, and the chimney repair work looks professional. Someone's planning to stay, Tom. Someone's trying to bring that place back to life." The bell above the door chimed, and Martha Kowalski bustled in, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Tom, thank goodness you're here. Have you heard about—" "Oh, hello, Sarah." She paused, noting the tension in the air. "I guess you have heard." "Heard what, Martha?" Tom asked, though Jed could tell he already knew the answer. "About the Mackenzie place. Words spreading all over town. Jenny Walsh was driving her kids to school this morning when she saw the smoke too. By the time she got to the school, half the parents were talking about it." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon unwanted attention. "People are saying all sorts of things. Some think it's those motorcycle people from over in Millfield. Others are worried it might be drug dealers looking for a remote place to set up shop." "Drug dealers," Sarah scoffed, "in Cedar Falls? Martha, this isn't Miami Vice." "You'd be surprised what goes on in remote places these days," Martha replied defensively. "My sister lives down in Bozeman, and she says the drug problem there is terrible. All kinds of criminals setting up operations in abandoned buildings." Jed couldn't listen anymore. The weight of their speculation, the fear and suspicion in their voices, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He set down the bag of feed he'd been holding and walked toward the back of the store, needing space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to handle what was coming. But Tom's voice followed him. "What do you think we should do? Call the sheriff?" "I don't know," Sarah said uncertainly. "Sheriff Patterson's got his hands full with that domestic situation over in Pine Ridge, and it's not like anyone's actually been threatened. Maybe we should just wait and see what happens." "Wait and see," Martha echoed, her voice rising. "Sarah, honey, that farm has been cursed since the day everything went wrong. Nothing good has ever come from that place, and nothing good ever will. Whoever's there needs to leave before something terrible happens again. Cursed. Sarah's scientific mind clearly rebelled against the notion. Martha, that's superstition talking. There's no such thing as a cursed farm. Tell that to the Mackenzie family, Martha said quietly. Tell that to poor little Annie Mackenzie, who died in that house when she was just 8 years old. Tell that to her father, who couldn't handle the grief and just disappeared one day, leaving everything behind. The words hit Jed like a sledgehammer to the chest. Annie. They were talking about Annie. His little girl, his bright-eyed daughter who'd loved horses and wildflowers and the way the creek sang at night. The daughter he'd failed to protect, failed to save, failed to keep safe in the house he'd built with his own hands. He must have made some sound, a gasp, a groan, something, because suddenly the conversation behind him stopped. When he turned around, all three of them were staring at him with concern and growing suspicion. "Jed," Sarah said carefully, "are you all right? You look like you're about to pass out." He tried to speak, tried to find words that would deflect their attention, but his throat felt like it was full of sand. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past, the protective distance he'd maintained between Jed Cavanaugh, the drifter, and the man he'd once been, crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. "I need some air," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. But as he moved toward the door, Tom's voice stopped him cold. "Wait a minute," the store owner said slowly, and Jed could hear the pieces clicking together in his mind. "Jed Cavanaugh. I knew that name sounded familiar when you first introduced yourself, but I couldn't place it." A pause, heavy with realization. "Your name's not really Jed, is it? It's Joseph. Joseph Edward Mackenzie." The silence that followed was deafening. Jed Joe stood frozen in the middle of the store, his secret exposed, his carefully maintained anonymity shattered. Outside, life in Cedar Falls continued as it always had, but inside Morrison's general store, everything had changed forever. "Joe Mackenzie," Martha whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Annie's father. Oh my God, you're the one what?" Sarah demanded, looking back and forth between them. "Who is he?" But Jed was already moving toward the door, driven by the same instinct that had kept him running for 3 years. Behind him, he could hear Tom calling his name, the real name, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now, not when the weight of his past was crashing down on him like an avalanche. As he stepped out onto Main Street, Jed knew that his time of hiding was over. The ghosts he'd been running from had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run. The abandoned farm past Widow's Creek was calling him home, whether he was ready or not. And somewhere in his heart, beneath all the pain and fear and guilt, a small voice whispered that maybe it was time to stop running and finally face what he'd left behind. The walk to Widow's Creek took 40 minutes, but for Joe Mackenzie, it felt like crossing 15 years of buried grief. Each step carried him closer to the place he'd sworn never to return to, the farm where his daughter's laughter had once echoed through the rooms, and his wife, Mary's garden, had bloomed with prize-winning tomatoes. The place where everything good in his life had died on a cold February night, when pneumonia took his 8-year-old daughter and his will to keep living. The old wooden bridge over Widow's Creek groaned under his weight, just as it always had. Joe paused in the middle, looking down at the water that ran clear and cold over smooth stones worn by decades of mountain runoff. Annie used to catch minnows here with her small hands, squealing with delight when the silvery fish slipped between her fingers. She'd named them all, Sparkle, Flash, tiny as if they were pets instead of wild creatures that belonged to the creek. On the far side of the bridge, the dirt road curved through a stand of aspen trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze. Joe's boots found the familiar ruts automatically, muscle memory guiding him along a path he'd traveled thousands of times during the 12 years he'd called this place home. Mary had been pregnant with Annie when they'd first driven up this road, full of hope and dreams about raising their family in the mountain peace they both craved. The aspen grove opened into the clearing where the farmhouse stood, and Joe's breath caught in his throat. Someone had indeed been living here, working here, caring for the place with a devotion that spoke of deep connection rather than casual occupation. The sagging front porch had been reinforced with new posts, the broken windows had been replaced with glass that caught the afternoon sun, and the roof wore fresh shingles that would keep out the worst of the mountain weather. Smoke rose from the stone chimney he'd built with his own hands 20 years ago, and the scent of burning pine carried memories so vivid they made his knees weak. How many evenings had he and Mary sat on that porch, watching Annie chase fireflies in the gathering dusk while supper cooled on the kitchen table? How many mornings had he carried coffee out to the barn while frost glittered on the pasture grass like scattered diamonds? But it was the garden that broke his heart. Someone had cleared away 15 years of weeds and volunteer trees to reveal the raised beds Mary had designed with such care. The soil had been turned and amended, ready for spring planting, and Joe could see where new fence posts had been set to keep out the deer and elk that had probably been browsing here undisturbed for years. A movement in the barn doorway caught his attention. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in work clothes, her greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hands dirty from whatever task she'd been performing. When she saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, she went completely still, as if she were looking at a ghost, which, Joe supposed, he was. "Hello, Joe," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the distance between them like a prayer or a curse. "I've been wondering when you'd come home." Rose Henderson, Mary's sister, 5 years younger and stubborn as a mountain goat. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been screaming at him in the cemetery after Annie's funeral, telling him he was a coward for wanting to sell the farm, accusing him of betraying Mary's memory and Annie's legacy. They'd exchanged harsh words that cut deep on both sides, and when Joe had finally packed his truck and driven away from Cedar Falls, Rose had been standing in this very clearing, watching him leave with tears streaming down her face. "Rose," he said, his voice rusty from the shock of seeing her here, "what are you doing? What does it look like I'm doing?" She gestured toward the restored buildings, the cleared garden, the signs of careful maintenance everywhere. "I'm taking care of what you abandoned." The words stung, partly because they were true. Joe had abandoned this place, had walked away from everything he and Mary had built together, because staying hurt too much and leaving seemed like the only way to survive the crushing weight of his grief. "I didn't ask you to do that," he said. "No, you didn't." Rose stepped closer, and Joe could see the lines that 15 years had etched around her eyes, the grey that had crept into hair that used to be the same chestnut brown as Mary's. "You didn't ask for anything. You just left. Didn't even say goodbye to the people who loved you." "Rose, I couldn't." "Couldn't what?" "Couldn't face the fact that Annie was gone? Couldn't stand to live in the house where she died?" Rose's voice was steady, but Joe could hear the pain underneath it, the old hurt that had festered for years. "You think you were the only one who grieved her? You think Mary's family didn't love that little girl just as much as you did?" Joe felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight that had pressed down on him every day since Annie's death. "It wasn't the same," he said quietly. "She was my daughter, my responsibility. I was supposed to protect her." "From pneumonia?" Rose's voice cracked slightly. "Joe, she got sick. Kids get sick sometimes, and sometimes they don't get better. It wasn't your fault." But Joe had heard those words before, from doctors and well-meaning friends, and the pastor who'd officiated at Annie's funeral. They'd never helped then, and they didn't help now. The logical part of his mind knew that pneumonia wasn't something a father could prevent or cure with willpower alone. But the deeper part, the part that had loved his daughter more than his own life, would never accept that he hadn't somehow failed in his most basic duty. "Why are you here, Rose?" he asked, changing the subject because he couldn't bear to continue the other conversation. "Why now?" Rose was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to decide how much truth he could handle. Because someone needed to remember, she said finally. Because Mary loved this place, and Annie was born here, and it seemed wrong to just let it rot away like none of that mattered. She gestured toward the farmhouse, and Joe could see the pride in her face, the satisfaction of work well done. I've been coming here on weekends for the past 2 years, fixing things up little by little. Harold thinks I'm crazy, but he helps anyway. We've got the well working again, and the electricity reconnected. Even got the old truck running. Joe's heart lurched. The truck? The blue Ford. It was sitting in the barn, under a tarp, just like you left it. Took some work. But Harold knows engines. It purrs like a kitten now. The blue Ford. Joe remembered buying that truck when Annie was 6, how excited she'd been to ride in the cab beside him when he did his rounds of the property. She'd insisted on naming it Blueberry, and the name had stuck even when Mary rolled her eyes at their silliness. I don't know what you want me to say, Joe said, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of memory and Rose's obvious devotion to preserving what he'd abandoned. I don't want you to say anything, Rose replied. I want you to decide what you're going to do now that you're here, because like it or not, this is still your land, Joe. This is still your home. And maybe it's time you figured out whether you're going to keep running from it or finally come back to where you belong. Rose led him into the farmhouse, and Joe felt like he was walking through a museum of his former life. The hardwood floors he'd sanded and stained himself gleamed with fresh polish. The kitchen cabinets Mary had painted yellow to catch the morning sun had been restored to their original warm glow. Even the old cast-iron stove, which had been Annie's favourite spot to sit and colour while Mary cooked Sunday dinner, had been cleaned until it shone like new. But it was the mantelpiece that stopped him cold. Rose had arranged a collection of photographs there, images Joe thought he'd lost forever. There was Mary on their wedding day, radiant in the simple white dress she'd sewn herself. Annie at age 5, missing her 2 front teeth, but grinning as she held up a string of fish they'd caught at the creek. The 3 of them together at Annie's 8th birthday party, just 2 months before she died, all of them laughing at something Harold had said while taking the picture. I saved what I could, Rose said quietly, noticing his stare. Mary always said a house wasn't a home without family pictures on the mantel. Joe reached out with trembling fingers to touch the frame holding Annie's school picture from 1st grade. She'd been so proud of that picture, had made him promise to put it on his desk at the feed store where he'd worked before starting the farm. Her hair was in pigtails with red ribbons, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of pure joy that only children possess. I thought they were all lost, he whispered. I found them in a box in the attic. Mice had gotten to some, but most were fine. Rose moved to stand beside him, her voice gentle now. She was beautiful, Joe, just like her mother. The familiar ache spread through his chest, but for the first time in 15 years, it wasn't entirely unbearable. Maybe it was being in this house again, surrounded by reminders of happier times. Maybe it was Rose's presence, connecting him to the family he'd tried so hard to forget. Or maybe he was just too tired to keep running from the pain. How long have you been staying here? He asked. Full time? About 6 months. Harold wasn't happy about it at first, but he understands why it matters to me. Rose moved to the kitchen and put a kettle on the stove. Would you like some coffee? I've got your old percolator working again. The normalcy of the offer, coffee in his own kitchen, from his own pot, felt surreal. Rose, I don't understand why you do all this. After what I said to you, after how I left, you were grieving, she said simply. People say things they don't mean when they're in that much pain. I was grieving too, and I said things I shouldn't have. But grief doesn't last forever, Joe. Eventually, you have to decide whether you're going to let it destroy you or find a way to honor what you've lost. She pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, the same blue ceramic mugs he and Mary had used every morning for 12 years, and Joe felt another wave of recognition wash over him. Everything in this house spoke of the life he'd abandoned, the happiness he'd walked away from because staying hurt too much. "Tell me about the last 15 years, Rose said, settling into the kitchen chair that had always been hers during family visits. "Where have you been? How have you survived?" Joe took the chair across from her, the same one where he'd eaten thousands of meals and helped Annie with her homework and planned seasons' worth of crops with Mary. "I've been moving around, odd jobs, seasonal work. Spent some time in Montana, some in Idaho. Last few years I've been up in the high country, living rough." "Living rough," Rose repeated, and there was something in her tone that made him look at her more carefully. "You mean homeless?" "I had shelter, caves, abandoned cabins. It wasn't—" "Joe." Rose's voice was firm but not unkind. "You've been homeless for 15 years because you couldn't forgive yourself for something that wasn't your fault. You've been punishing yourself by living like you don't deserve a real life." The words hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Joe stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise from the dark surface. "Maybe I don't deserve a real life. Maybe some mistakes are too big to come back from." "What mistakes?" Rose leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Loving your daughter? Taking care of her when she got sick? Sitting by her bedside for 3 days straight while she fought for every breath? I should have gotten her to the hospital sooner, should have realized how sick she was." "You did realize. You called Doc Peterson the first night she had a fever. He said it was just a cold, told you to keep her warm and give her plenty of fluids." Rose's voice grew stronger, more insistent. "You followed his instructions exactly. When her condition worsened, you drove her to the hospital in the middle of a snowstorm that had the roads nearly impassable. You did everything a father could do." Joe remembered that night with perfect, terrible clarity. Annie burning with fever, her small body shaking with chills despite the blankets he'd wrapped around her. The desperate drive down the mountain while snow fell so thick his headlights barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. The emergency room doctors working frantically while he paced the waiting area, praying to a God he'd stopped believing in the moment they told him his daughter was gone. "It wasn't enough," he said quietly. "It was everything," Rose replied. "And Mary knew that. She never blamed you. Not for a second. The only person who blamed you was you." Through the kitchen window, Joe could see the barn where he'd kept Annie's pony, Buttercup, a gentle mare who tolerated a little girl's enthusiastic but inexperienced handling with the patience of a saint. The pasture beyond was overgrown now, but he could picture it as it had been, dotted with wildflowers that Annie had insisted they never mow because they were too pretty to cut down. "I found something else," Rose said, her voice gentler now. She reached into a wooden box on the counter and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Mary's diary from Annie's last year. She wrote in it every day right up until the end. Joe's hands shook as he took the journal. Mary's neat handwriting filled the pages, documenting the small joys and daily adventures of their family life. Annie's first successful ride on Buttercup without help, the day she learned to whistle, her excitement about starting 3rd grade in the fall. And on the last page, written just days before Annie got sick, Mary had recorded her thoughts about their life together. "Joe is such a good father. Annie adores him, and I love watching them together. She has his stubborn streak and his gentle heart. Whatever happens in this world, I know she'll always be surrounded by love." Joe closed the journal carefully, unable to read any more. The words were a gift and a torment, proof of the happiness they'd shared and a reminder of everything he'd lost. "She loved you, Joe," Rose said softly. "They both did. And running away from that love hasn't honored their memory. It's just wasted 15 years of a life they would have wanted you to live." The sound of vehicles approaching pulled Joe from his thoughts. Through the kitchen window, he could see a small convoy making its way up the dirt road, Tom Morrison's pickup truck leading the way, followed by Sarah Chen's SUV and what looked like Sheriff Patterson's official vehicle. The sight filled him with a mixture of dread and resignation. He'd known this moment would come eventually. Looks like word has spread, Rose observed, moving to stand beside him at the window. Tom probably felt obligated to check on things once he realized who you were. Joe watched the vehicles parked near the front porch, saw the familiar faces emerge into the afternoon sunlight. Tom looked uncomfortable, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Sarah appeared concerned but determined. Sheriff Patterson, a lean man in his 50s who'd held the position for over a decade, surveyed the property with professional interest. "I should go talk to them," Joe said, but his feet seemed rooted to the kitchen floor. "We should go talk to them," Rose corrected. "You're not alone in this anymore, Joe. Whether you like it or not, you've got family who cares about what happens to you." They walked out onto the front porch together, and Joe felt the weight of multiple gazes assessing him. Tom stepped forward first, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Joe," he said quietly, "Sarah told us what happened at the Divance store. I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine, Tom. Just needed some air, some space to think." Sheriff Patterson moved closer, his hand resting casually on his belt, not threatening but ready. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm Sheriff Patterson. I know we've never formally met, but I remember when you lived here before. I was a deputy then, just starting out." Joe nodded, remembering a younger man in uniform who'd been kind but professional during the difficult days surrounding Annie's death. "Sheriff, I've been getting calls all afternoon about someone occupying this property. People are concerned, and frankly, there are some legal questions that need to be addressed." Patterson's tone was respectful but firm. "Can you tell me what your current relationship is to this land?" "It's still his property," Rose interjected before Joe could answer. "Never sold it? Never transferred ownership?" "The taxes are current. I've been paying them for the past 5 years. Sarah stepped forward, her medical training evident in the way she studied Joe's face for signs of distress or confusion. "Joe, when you left the store earlier, you looked like you were in shock. Are you feeling all right now?" The genuine concern in her voice touched something in Joe that had been frozen for years. These people barely knew him, yet they'd driven all the way out here to make sure he was safe. It was the kind of community care that he'd forgotten existed. "I'm all right, Sarah. Thank you for asking." He gestured toward the restored buildings around them. "I guess I was just surprised to see what Rose has done with the place." "It's incredible," Tom said, looking around with obvious admiration. "When I drove past here last month, it still looked abandoned." "Rose, you've worked miracles." "Not miracles," Rose replied. "Just time and determination, and Harold's help on the heavy work." Sheriff Patterson walked to the edge of the porch, studying the property with a more detailed eye. "Mrs. Henderson, when you've been staying here, have you had any problems, trespassers, vandalism, anything like that?" "Nothing serious. A few kids from town have come out here over the years, probably on dares. I've had to run off some hunters who thought the place was abandoned, but mostly it's been peaceful." "Good." Patterson turned back to Joe. "Mr. Mackenzie, I have to ask, what are your intentions regarding this property? Are you planning to stay, or were you just visiting?" It was the question Joe had been dreading, partly because he didn't have an answer himself. 6 hours ago, he'd been Jed Cavanaugh, a drifter with no permanent address and no ties to anywhere or anyone. Now he was standing on the front porch of the house where his daughter had been born, surrounded by people who knew his real name and his tragic history, being asked to make decisions about a future he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I didn't even know. Rose was here until today. I've been living rough for a long time, Sheriff. The idea of settling down anywhere feels complicated." "Complicated how?" Sarah asked gently. Joe struggled to find words that would explain the bone-deep terror he felt at the thought of allowing himself to care about a place again, to invest in something that could be lost. "This farm holds a lot of memories. Not all of them are easy to live with. But some of them are good," Rose said quietly. "Some of them are worth preserving." Tom nodded thoughtfully. You know, Joe, Cedar Falls has changed some since you've been gone, but the core of the community is the same. People here look out for each other. If you decided to stay, to try to make a go of it again, you wouldn't be doing it alone. What would I farm? Joe asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. The land's been fallow for 15 years. It would take time to build back the soil, to figure out what crops would work best now. Actually, Sarah said, brightening, there's been a lot of interest in organic farming in this area. Some of the younger families moving to Cedar Falls are specifically looking for local sources of vegetables and herbs. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store has been asking around about finding reliable suppliers. And the farmers' market in Millfield has really taken off, Tom added, every Saturday during the growing season. People drive from 3 counties away to buy fresh, local produce. Joe felt something stirring in his chest, a dangerous flutter of possibility that he tried to suppress. I don't have equipment anymore. Don't have seed money. Or, the old tractor's still in the barn, Rose said. Harold got it running last spring. And there's a credit union in town now that specializes in agricultural loans. They've helped a lot of people get started. Sheriff Patterson had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Mr. Mackenzie, if you're serious about considering this, there are some practical matters we should discuss. Insurance, utilities, that sort of thing. But from a legal standpoint, there's nothing preventing you from resuming residence on your own property. The weight of their expectations, their encouragement, pressed down on Joe like a physical force. Part of him wanted to run again, to disappear back into the mountains where the only person he could disappoint or fail was himself. But another part, a part he'd thought was dead, whispered that maybe it was time to stop running. I need to think, he said finally. This is all happening very fast. Of course, Sarah said. Take all the time you need. But Joe, don't disappear again without saying goodbye. People care about you, whether you realize it or not. As the visitors prepared to leave, Tom hung back for a moment. Joe, your job at the store is still there if you want it. No questions asked. And if you decide to try farming again, well, I carry seeds and tools and just about everything else you'd need to get started. We can work out payment terms that make sense. After the vehicles had disappeared down the dirt road, Joe and Rose stood together on the porch in the gathering dusk. The mountains rose around them like protective walls, and the creek sang its eternal song in the distance. For the first time in 15 years, Joe allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to wake up in this house again, to watch the sunrise paint the peaks gold and pink, to plant seeds in soil he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Joe barely slept that first night back in the farmhouse. Rose had insisted he take the master bedroom, the room he'd shared with Mary, where Annie had crawled into bed with them on stormy nights and Christmas mornings. The bed was the same oak frame he'd built during their first year of marriage, but Rose had replaced the mattress and linens with care. Everything was clean and fresh, yet the room still held echoes of laughter and whispered conversations and the quiet breathing of a family at peace. He lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds, the settling of old timber, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant call of a barn owl hunting in the pasture. These were the sounds that had lullabied him to sleep for 12 years, and their return felt both comforting and unsettling, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit. When dawn finally came, Joe dressed quietly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Rose already up, coffee brewing in the old percolator. She looked tired too, and he wondered if she'd been wrestling with her own demons during the night. "Morning," she said, pouring him a cup without being asked. "Sleep at all?" "Some. You. Some." She settled into her chair with her own coffee, and they sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun climb above the eastern ridge. "Harold's coming by this morning to check on that fence in the north pasture. I thought you might want to walk the property with us. See what all needs doing." The invitation was casual, but Joe heard the deeper question beneath it. Was he planning to stay long enough to care about fence repairs and pasture management? Was he going to invest in this place again, or was he just passing through? "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with the decision. Harold Henderson arrived just after 9, driving his familiar red pickup and wearing the same style of work clothes he'd favored for decades. He was grayer now, his movements a little stiffer, but his handshake was still firm, and his eyes still held the quiet wisdom that had made him one of the most respected men in the valley. "Joe," he said simply, "good to see you." "Harold, thank you for everything you've done here. Rose told me you've been helping with the restoration work." "Rose's family," Harold replied, as if that explained everything, and in the mountain way of thinking it did. Family helped family, no questions asked, no debts tallied. They walked the property together, and Joe marveled at what Rose and Harold had accomplished. The irrigation ditches had been cleared and repaired. The fence lines were straight and tight. The barn that had been leaning dangerously when he left now stood square and solid, its roof newly shingled and its foundation reinforced. In the equipment shed, Harold showed him the restored tractor, a 1985 John Deere that Joe had bought used when Annie was 3. It gleamed with fresh paint and new parts, and when Harold turned the key, it started with the reliable purr. Joe remembered. "Took some doing," Harold said with obvious pride. "Had to rebuild the engine, replace most of the hydraulics. But she's solid now. Should give you another 20 years of good service." "Harold, I don't know if I'm staying," Joe said quietly. "I don't want you to think..." "Son," Harold interrupted gently, "Rose and I didn't do this work expecting anything in return. We did it because it needed doing, and because this place meant something to people we love. Whether you stay or go is your decision, but if you do decide to stay, you'll have a good foundation to build on." They walked to the north pasture, where a section of fence had been damaged by a fallen tree during the previous winter's storms. As they worked together to repair the wire and reset the posts, Joe felt his hands remembering skills he'd thought he'd forgotten. The rhythm of physical labor, the satisfaction of fixing something broken, the quiet companionship of working alongside people who understood the value of honest effort. "Tell me about the town," Joe said as they stretched new wire between posts. "Rose said things have changed some." "Some," Harold agreed. "We've got more young families now, people looking for a simpler way of life. That's brought new businesses, the credit union Tom mentioned, a couple of cafes, even a small bookstore. But the core of the community is the same. People still help their neighbors, still believe in doing right by each other. And they'd accept me back? After the way I left?" Harold paused in his work, meeting Joe's eyes directly. "Joe, you left because you were hurting so bad you couldn't see straight. People understood that." "Oh, there might have been some hard feelings at first. Folks felt like you abandoned them when they wanted to help you through your grief. But time has a way of softening those edges. Most people just want to see you find some peace." "I'm not sure I deserve peace," Joe said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "That's not for you to decide," Rose said firmly. She'd been listening from her position replacing a rotten fence post. "Peace isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something you accept when you're finally ready to stop punishing yourself for being human." That afternoon, after Harold had gone home and the fence work was completed, Joe found himself alone in Annie's room, for the first time since returning. Rose had preserved it carefully, the twin bed with its yellow comforter, the bookshelf full of picture books and early readers, the window that looked out over the pasture where Buttercup used to graze. On the small desk sat Annie's treasure box, a painted wooden container where she'd kept her most precious possessions. Joe opened it with trembling hands and found the contents just as she'd left them. A collection of smooth creek stones, a dried wildflower pressed between pieces of glass, a photograph of the three of them at a church picnic, and a letter she'd written to him for Father's Day, carefully printed in pencil. "Dear Daddy," it read, "you are the best daddy in the whole world. I love when you read me stories, and when we catch fish, and when you let me help with the animals. I hope I can live on this farm forever and ever. Love, Annie. Joe sank into the small chair beside her desk, the letter clutched in his hands, and for the first time since her death, he allowed himself to truly grieve. Not the angry, desperate grief that had driven him away from this place, but the deep, healing sorrow of a father who had loved his daughter completely and would carry that love with him always. The tears came in waves, 15 years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. He cried for Annie, for Mary, for the family they'd been and the future they'd never have. But he also cried for the man he'd been before. Tragedy struck a man who'd believed in hope and second chances, who'd built this farm with his own hands as a legacy for his daughter. When the storm of grief finally passed, Joe felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Emptiness that wasn't filled with rage or guilt, but simply with space for whatever might come next. Maybe that was what peace felt like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of possibility. 3 days later, Joe was in the barn repairing harness leather when he heard the sound of an unfamiliar vehicle coming up the road. Through the open barn door, he watched a silver sedan navigate the dirt track carefully, its city tires struggling for purchase on the rutted surface. The car bore Colorado license plates and looked expensive, not the kind of vehicle that typically found its way to remote mountain farms. Rose emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, her expression wary. Joe set down his tools and walked to join her as the sedan pulled to a stop near the front porch. 2 men in business suits climbed out, looking distinctly uncomfortable in their polished shoes and pressed clothing. The older of the two, a heavy-set man in his 50s with silver hair and an air of professional authority, approached them with a briefcase in hand. His companion was younger, carrying a leather portfolio and the slightly anxious demeanor of someone eager to prove himself. "Good afternoon," the older man said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "I'm looking for Joseph Mackenzie. I'm Robert Crane, attorney with Crane, Morrison and Associates out of Denver. This is my associate, Michael Webb." Joe stepped forward, feeling Rose tense beside him. "I'm Joe Mackenzie. What can I do for you?" Crane's eyes took in Joe's work clothes and weathered appearance, clearly noting the contrast between what he'd expected and what he'd found. "Mr. Mackenzie, I represent Mountain Vista Development Corporation. We've been trying to locate you for some time regarding a matter of significant importance to both parties. I can't imagine what business I'd have with a development corporation," Joe said carefully. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," Crane suggested, glancing around the farm with obvious distaste. "This is a matter that requires some privacy." Rose spoke up before Joe could answer. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here. This is a working farm, Mr. Crane, not a boardroom." Crane's smile tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Very well. Mr. Mackenzie, are you aware that your property sits directly adjacent to what will soon become one of Colorado's premier luxury resort developments?" "No," Joe said flatly. "I wasn't aware of that. The Widow's Creek Resort and Spa," Webb chimed in, consulting his portfolio. "A $200 million project featuring a luxury hotel, championship golf course, spa facilities, and high-end residential properties. Construction is scheduled to begin next spring." Joe felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though he kept his expression neutral. "And this concerns me how?" "Well," Crane said, opening his briefcase and withdrawing a thick folder, "your property represents the final piece of the puzzle. Mountain Vista has spent 3 years acquiring all the surrounding land. Your farm is the only remaining private property within the project boundaries." Rose stepped closer to Joe, her presence a steadying force. "Are you saying you want to buy the farm?" "Among other things," Crane replied. "But first, Mr. Mackenzie, I need to inform you of a legal matter that's come to our attention during our research into the property's ownership history." He pulled a document from the folder and held it out to Joe. "Are you familiar with this mortgage agreement?" Joe took the paper with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. It was indeed a mortgage document, dated 18 years ago, bearing his signature and Mary's. The amount was substantial, far more than they'd ever borrowed against the farm. "I don't understand," Joe said, scanning the legal language. "Mary and I paid off our mortgage years before she died. We owned this property free and clear." "According to our research," Webb said, consulting his notes, "this secondary mortgage was taken out to cover medical expenses related to your daughter's illness. The payments were current until approximately 15 years ago, at which point they ceased entirely." Joe's blood turned to ice water. "That's impossible. We never took out a second mortgage. Our daughter's medical bills were covered by insurance." "I'm afraid that's not what the record shows," Crane said, his tone sympathetic but firm. "The insurance company denied several claims related to experimental treatments that weren't covered under your policy. According to the documentation we've obtained, you borrowed against the property to pay those bills." "Let me see that," Rose demanded, holding out her hand for the document. She read it quickly, her face growing pale. "Joe, this signature, it does look like yours." "But it's not mine," Joe said, his voice growing stronger. "Rose, you know Mary and I discussed every major financial decision. We would never have taken out a loan this size without talking about it extensively, and we certainly wouldn't have done it without telling you and Harold." Crane exchanged a glance with his associate. "Mr. Mackenzie, I understand this comes as a shock. Financial stress during a family medical crisis often leads to decisions people don't clearly remember. The important thing now is determining how to resolve the situation." "What situation?" Joe asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. "The mortgage has been in default for 15 years, Webb explained. With accumulated interest and penalties, the debt now exceeds $400,000. The current mortgage holder has been seeking resolution for some time." "Current mortgage holder?" Rose asked sharply. "Mountain Vista Development Corporation," Crane said. "We acquired the debt as part of our land acquisition strategy for the resort project." The pieces began falling into place in Joe's mind, creating a picture that made his stomach clench with rage and recognition. "You bought a fraudulent mortgage so you could foreclose on my property." "Mr. Mackenzie," Crane said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I understand you're upset, but the documentation is quite clear. The mortgage is legitimate, properly recorded, and has been in default for 15 years. Mountain Vista has every legal right to pursue foreclosure proceedings." "Then why haven't you?" Joe asked. "Why come here and tell me about it?" "Because Mountain Vista prefers to resolve these matters amicably when possible. We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement, enough to pay off the debt and provide you with a significant sum to start fresh somewhere else. All we need is your agreement to vacate the property within 60 days. Joe looked at the document again, studying the signature that did indeed resemble his handwriting. But something about it nagged at him, a slight difference in the way the letters were formed, a hesitancy in strokes that had always been confident and bold. "I want to see the original documents," he said. "Not copies. The actual paperwork with the original signatures." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Crane replied. "The originals are in a secure facility in Denver, but I can assure you that everything has been properly authenticated." "By whom?" Rose asked. "Who authenticated these signatures?" "That's privileged information," Webb said, "but I can tell you that handwriting analysis confirmed the signatures are genuine." Joe felt something cold and dangerous settling in his chest. Someone had forged his and Mary's signatures on a mortgage document, then waited 15 years to spring the trap. Someone had been planning to steal his land all along, using his daughter's death and his own grief-stricken absence as cover for their scheme. "How long do I have?" he asked quietly. "As I mentioned, we'd prefer to see this resolved within 60 days, Crane said. "But if you're not interested in our settlement offer, we can begin foreclosure proceedings immediately." I should warn you that legal fees and court costs would be added to the debt, making your situation considerably worse. And if I fight this, if I prove the documents are fraudulent, then you'll spend years in court and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees with no guarantee of success, Crane replied. Mr. Mackenzie, you've been living as a transient for 15 years. Do you really have the resources to fight a corporation with unlimited legal budget? After the lawyers left, Joe and Rose stood in the farmyard, watching the sedan disappear down the road. The peaceful morning had been shattered, replaced by the familiar feeling of having everything he cared about threatened by forces beyond his control. It's a setup, Rose said quietly. Someone forged those documents. I know, Joe replied. The question is who and why they waited so long to use them. What are you going to do? Joe looked around the farm at the house where his daughter had been born, the barn where he'd taught her to milk cows, the pastures where she'd played with their dogs, and dreamed about the future. For 3 days, he'd been allowing himself to hope that maybe he could rebuild his life here. Now that hope was being threatened by the same kind of greed and corruption that had driven him into the mountains in the first place. But this time, he wasn't going to run. This time, he was going to fight. I'm going to find out who's behind this, he said, and I'm going to stop them. Joe spent that evening in the farmhouse kitchen, spreading documents across the table like pieces of a puzzle he was determined to solve. Rose sat beside him, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined bank statements and insurance records she'd saved from Mary's effects. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across papers that told the story of a family's final months together, medical bills, insurance, correspondence, and payment receipts that painted a picture very different from what the lawyers had claimed. Here, Rose said, pointing to a series of cancelled checks. These are the payments to the hospital and the specialists. Every one of them was covered by insurance or paid directly by you and Mary. There's no gap that would require a second mortgage. Joe nodded, studying an insurance statement from the company that had covered Annie's treatment. And this shows that all the experimental treatments were pre-approved. They covered everything except the last-ditch attempt in Denver, and that was only $3,000. We paid that out of savings. So where did this supposed $400,000 debt come from? Rose asked, holding up the mortgage document the lawyers had left behind. Someone wanted to make sure that if I ever came back to claim this land, they'd have a way to take it from me, Joe said grimly. The question is, who knew enough about our financial situation to forge convincing documents? Rose was quiet for a moment, then looked up with a troubled expression. Joe, there's something I never told you about the weeks after you left. Someone came around asking questions about the farm, about whether you might come back, about what your financial situation had been. Joe's attention sharpened. Who? A man claiming to be from the county assessor's office said he was updating property records. Harold thought something was off about him, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too focused on my own grief to pay attention to some bureaucrat with a clipboard. What kind of questions was he asking? Personal things. About Mary's medical bills, about your insurance coverage, about whether you'd taken out any loans. I told him it wasn't any of his business, but now I wonder if he was gathering information for this scheme. Joe stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark silhouettes of the mountains against the starlit sky. Somewhere out there, people in expensive suits were plotting to steal the last place on earth that held his family's memory. The rage that had been building in his chest all day crystallized into cold determination. We need help, he said. We need someone who understands how these land deals work, someone who knows how to fight corporations with deep pockets. I might know someone, Rose said quietly. Do you remember Jennifer Walsh? She used to be Jennifer Morrison, Tom's youngest daughter. She became a lawyer, moved to Denver, specializes in fighting exactly these kinds of cases. Joe turned back to face her. You think she'd help us? I think she'd be furious when she heard what they're trying to do. Jenny always had a strong sense of justice, even as a kid, and she knows this community, knows what this land means to the families who've worked it for generations. The next morning, Rose called Jennifer Walsh from the kitchen phone while Joe listened on the extension in the living room. Jenny's voice was older now, confident with the authority that came from years of successful practice, but Joe could still hear echoes of the determined little girl who'd organized neighborhood cleanup campaigns and stood up to bullies twice her size. "Aunt Rose," Jenny said warmly, "what a wonderful surprise. How are you?" "I'm fine, honey, but I'm calling about a legal problem that's come up. It involves Joe Mackenzie. You remember Annie's father?" "Of course I remember Joe. I was devastated when he left town. Annie was in my little sister's class." "What kind of legal problem?" Rose explained the situation, describing the lawyer's visit and the mortgage document they'd presented. As she talked, Joe could hear Jenny's tone growing increasingly sharp and professional. "Let me understand this," Jenny said, when Rose finished. "Mountain Vista Development claims to hold a mortgage on Joe's property that was supposedly taken out 18 years ago, but Joe has no memory of signing it?" "That's right. And we have documentation showing that all of Annie's medical expenses were covered by insurance or paid from their savings account. There was never any need for a second mortgage. And this development company just happens to be building a resort on the surrounding land they've been acquiring for 3 years? Jenny's voice carried the skeptical tone of someone who'd seen too many corporate land grabs. "Rose, this has all the hallmarks of a fraudulent foreclosure scheme. They probably have a dozen fake mortgages they can pull out whenever they need to acquire a property." "Can we fight it?" Joe asked, speaking for the first time. "Joe," Jenny said, her voice softening, "I was so sorry to hear about Annie, and I always hoped you'd come home someday. Of course we can fight this. In fact, I'd consider it a privilege to take on these vultures. What do we need to do? First, I need you to gather every financial document from that time period, bank statements, insurance records, cancelled checks, everything. Second, I need to examine that mortgage document they showed you. If it's forged, there will be evidence. Forgers always make mistakes, especially when they're trying to recreate documents from years ago." "How long will this take?" Rose asked. "Hard to say. It depends on how sophisticated their fraud is and how much evidence we can gather. But Joe, I want you to know that you're not fighting this alone. This kind of corporate theft makes my blood boil, and I have resources they don't know about." After they hung up, Joe felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hope backed by concrete action. For the first time since the lawyer's visit, he began to believe that maybe his family's legacy could be protected. The rest of the morning was spent in preparation. Joe drove into town to make copies of documents at the library, while Rose organized files at the farmhouse. Tom Morrison proved invaluable, remembering details about the farm's financial history and providing character references that would help establish Joe's credibility. It was Sarah Chen who provided the breakthrough they needed. She stopped by the farm that afternoon with news that changed everything. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said, settling into a kitchen chair while Rose poured coffee. "About the man who came around asking questions after Joe left. It reminded me of something my predecessor mentioned when I took over the veterinary practice." "Doc Peterson?" Joe asked. "Yes, he told me about a case of suspected insurance fraud. He'd been asked to investigate something about falsified medical records and inflated treatment costs. He said it involved a family whose child had died, but the insurance company suspected someone was submitting fake claims using the child's name." Joe felt his blood run cold. "Annie. Doc Peterson never told me the family's name, patient confidentiality and all that. But now, I'm wondering if someone was using Annie's medical information to create fraudulent insurance claims, which would give them detailed knowledge of your family's finances. That would explain how they knew enough to forge a convincing mortgage document," Rose said. "If they had access to insurance records and medical files, they'd know exactly what your legitimate expenses were and how to create fake ones that looked plausible. Joe stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "We need to talk to Doc Peterson. If someone was using my daughter's death to commit insurance fraud, I want to know who." "Joe," Sarah said gently, "Doc Peterson passed away 2 years ago, but his records might still exist. His nephew took over his practice files when he retired." "Where's the nephew now?" "Phoenix, but he's coming up next month to settle the last of Doc Peterson's affairs. I could ask him to bring any files related to that insurance investigation." As the afternoon wore on, the pieces of the conspiracy began to take shape. Someone with access to medical records had used Annie's death as the foundation for a complex fraud scheme. They'd created fake insurance claims to learn the family's financial details, then used that information to forge a mortgage document they could use years later when the land became valuable enough to steal. The coldness of it, the calculated way they'd turned his daughter's death into a tool for theft, filled Joe with a rage so pure it felt like ice in his veins. But beneath the rage was something more powerful, the absolute certainty that he would not let them win. That evening, Joe stood alone in Annie's room, looking at the treasure box that had triggered his healing just days before. The letter she'd written about wanting to live on the farm forever took on new meaning now. She couldn't live here forever, but maybe, if he was strong enough and smart enough, her memory could. "I'm going to fight for this place, baby girl," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to fight for you, and for Mama, and for everyone who thinks they can. Steal what we built together. I promise you that." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending autumn leaves swirling across the farmyard. Storm clouds were building over the western peaks, promising the first real winter weather of the season. Joe watched the approaching storm and felt a matching tempest building in his own heart. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The confrontation came at dawn on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the lawyer's first visit. Joe was feeding the chickens Rose had brought to the farm when he heard the convoy of vehicles approaching more than before, their engines echoing off the surrounding hills like approaching thunder. This time, Mountain Vista Development had brought reinforcements. 5 vehicles pulled into the farmyard. 2 corporate sedans, a sheriff's deputy car, and 2 trucks carrying what looked like surveying equipment. Joe set down the bucket of chicken feed and walked toward the house, where Rose was already, standing on the front porch with her arms crossed and her jaw set for battle. Robert Crane emerged from the lead sedan, but he wasn't alone. A woman in an expensive suit followed him, tall, silver-haired, with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Behind them came the sheriff's deputy, a young man Joe didn't recognize, who looked uncomfortable with whatever he'd been asked to do. "Mr. Mackenzie," Crane called out, his voice carrying none of the false courtesy from their previous meeting. "This is Victoria Sterling, CEO of Mountain Vista Development. She's here to discuss the final resolution of your property situation." Victoria Sterling stepped forward, her heels clicking on the gravel driveway. Everything about her spoke of money and power, from her perfectly styled hair to her designer handbag to the way she surveyed the farm like a general assessing conquered territory. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike, "I understand you've been reluctant to accept our generous settlement offer. I'm here to explain why that's a mistake." "I'm listening," Joe said calmly, though every instinct told him to be ready for whatever was coming. Sterling gestured toward the deputy. "This is Officer Martinez. He's here to serve you with formal foreclosure papers. As of this morning, Mountain Vista Development has initiated legal proceedings to reclaim this property. You have 72 hours to vacate voluntarily, or the court will order your removal." The deputy stepped forward reluctantly, holding out an official-looking envelope. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm sorry about this, but I'm required to serve you these papers." Joe took the envelope, but didn't open it. "On whose authority?" "The mortgage holder's authority," Sterling replied smoothly. "The debt on this property has been in default for 15 years. Mountain Vista has been more than patient, but our investors require resolution. Your investors, Joe repeated. Tell me, Miss Sterling, do your investors know that the mortgage you're foreclosing on is fraudulent? Sterling's expression didn't change, but Joe caught a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or calculation. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mackenzie. I hope you have evidence to support it. As a matter of fact, I do. The voice came from behind the convoy of vehicles, clear and confident. Jennifer Walsh walked into the farmyard wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase, looking every inch the successful Denver attorney she'd become. Behind her came Tom Morrison, Harold Henderson, and Sheriff Patterson, their faces grim with purpose. Miss Sterling, Jenny said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. I'm Jennifer Walsh, representing Mr. Mackenzie. I think you'll find that your foreclosure papers are based on fraudulent documentation. Sterling's composure cracked slightly. And you are an attorney who specializes in corporate fraud and illegal land acquisition schemes. And I have some very interesting information about your supposed mortgage. Jenny opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. This contains the results of a forensic analysis of the mortgage documents you presented to my client. The analysis was conducted by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Document Examination Unit. She handed a copy of the report to Sterling, who scanned it quickly, her face growing paler with each page. According to the State Crime Lab, the signatures on your mortgage document were created using a tracing technique. The ink chemistry doesn't match samples from the same time period. And most damning of all, the paper itself contains watermarks that weren't used until 5 years after the alleged signing date. Furthermore, Jenny continued, her voice growing stronger, we've discovered evidence of a systematic insurance fraud scheme involving falsified medical claims submitted in Annie Mackenzie's name after her death. The person responsible for that fraud had access to detailed financial information about the Mackenzie family, which they used to create convincing but false mortgage documentation. Sterling looked at Crane, who was studying the forensic report with obvious dismay. How did you... she started, then stopped herself. How did we figure it out? Jenny smiled coldly. Corporate thieves always make the same mistake, Miss Sterling. They assume their victims won't fight back, and they get careless with their evidence. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, his hand resting on his badge. Miss Sterling, Mr. Crane, I'm going to need you to come with me to answer some questions about these documents. The district attorney is very interested in discussing this case with you. This is ridiculous, Sterling snapped, but Joe could see the fear creeping into her eyes. We'll fight this in court. Mountain Vista has unlimited resources. Actually, Jenny said, pulling out another document, you don't. As of this morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission has frozen Mountain Vista's assets, pending investigation of securities fraud related to your land acquisition practices. It seems this isn't the first property you've tried to steal using fake mortgages. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rustling through the aspen trees and the distant sound of chickens clucking in their pen. Joe watched Sterling's face as the reality of her situation sank in, saw the moment when her corporate arrogance crumbled into desperate calculation. This isn't over, she said finally, her voice losing its earlier confidence. Yes, Joe said quietly, it is. As Sheriff Patterson escorted Sterling and Crane toward his patrol car, Victoria Sterling made one last desperate attempt to salvage her scheme. She broke free from the sheriff's gentle guidance and spun around to face Joe, her corporate mask, finally slipping to reveal the raw desperation underneath. You don't understand what you're doing, she said, her voice rising with panic. This development would bring jobs to Cedar Falls, economic growth. Your little farm is standing in the way of progress that could benefit hundreds of families. Joe looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the polished executive who'd tried to intimidate him, but a woman who'd built her fortune by stealing from grieving families and destroying communities. Miss Sterling, he said quietly, My daughter died in this house 15 years ago. You used her death to try to steal the only place on earth where her memory lives. There isn't enough money in the world to make that right." "It was just business," Sterling protested, but even she seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. "No," Rose said, stepping down from the porch to stand beside Joe. "Business is honest work for honest pay. What you did was grave robbing. You fed off a family's tragedy like a vulture, and you thought nobody would ever be strong enough to stop you." Sheriff Patterson resumed his escort, but Sterling's voice carried back across the farmyard as she was placed in the patrol car. "We had contracts, investors. You've destroyed a $200 million project." "Good," Harold Henderson said simply. "Some things shouldn't be for sale." Jenny Walsh spent the next hour on her phone, coordinating with federal investigators and state prosecutors who'd been building cases against Mountain Vista for months. It turned out that Joe's farm was just the latest target in a pattern of fraudulent foreclosures that stretched across 3 states and involved dozens of properties. "They've been doing this for years," Jenny explained, as they gathered in the farmhouse kitchen afterward. "Find properties in rural areas that might become valuable for development, then manufacture fake debts they can use to steal the land when the time is right. Your case gave us the evidence we needed to bring down the whole operation." Tom Morrison, who'd been quiet through most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Joe, I owe you an apology. When you first came back to town, some of us wondered if you were running from something. Turns out you were running to something, the chance to protect what your family built here." "We all did what we thought was right," Joe replied. "I spent 15 years punishing myself for Annie's death, and that hurt a lot of people who cared about me. I'm the one who owes apologies." "No more apologies," Sarah Chen said firmly. She'd arrived just as the confrontation ended, summoned by Tom's phone call. "What matters now is what happens next." "Joe, are you planning to stay?" It was the question Joe had been avoiding for weeks, the decision he'd been afraid to make because choosing meant risking loss again. But standing in the kitchen where his family had shared thousands of meals, surrounded by people who'd fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself, the answer came easily. "I'm staying," he said. "This is home. It always was, even when I was too hurt to see it." "Then we need to talk about spring planting," Harold said with a grin. "That north field will be perfect for organic vegetables, and Sarah's right about the market opportunities. And the farmer's market in Millfield is always looking for reliable suppliers," Tom added. "I can put you in touch with the right people." As the afternoon wore on and the visitors gradually departed, Joe found himself alone with Rose on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The mountains looked the same as they always had, but everything else felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for 15 years had finally been lifted. "Do you think she would have approved?" Joe asked quietly. "Annie, I mean, of the way I handled this." Rose was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think she would have been proud to see her father stand up for their home. And I think she would have loved knowing that the land she wanted to live on forever will stay in the family." "Family," Joe repeated, testing the word. For years, it had been a source of pain, a reminder of what he'd lost. Now, it felt like a promise of what he might rebuild. "Speaking of family," Rose said with a smile, "Harold and I have been talking. We'd like to move back to the farm permanently if you'll have us. Harold's getting too old to maintain our place, and I've gotten attached to the work we've been doing here." Joe felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the evening sun. "I'd like that, more than you know." As darkness settled over the farmyard, Joe allowed himself to imagine the future spring seeds planted in soil he'd reclaimed. Summer evenings on the porch with people he loved, the slow rebuilding of a life that honored both memory and hope. Annie's dream of living on this farm forever had taken a form she never could have imagined. But maybe, in the end, that was what mattered most. The land would remember. The family would continue, and love, Joe was finally learning, was stronger than loss. 6 months later, Joe stood in the same spot where he'd first encountered the rusty shovel that had started his transformation. The spring morning air carried the scent of fresh-turned earth and the promise of new growth, and the fields around him hummed with the quiet energy of a farm coming back to life. The vegetables he'd planted in March were thriving. Neat rows of lettuce, spinach, and early peas stretched across the field that had once been choked with weeds, their green leaves bright against the dark soil. The greenhouse Rose had convinced him to build was filled with tomato and pepper seedlings that would be transplanted once the danger of frost passed. Even the old apple orchard was responding to Harold's careful pruning, showing more blossoms than it had produced in years. But it wasn't just the land that was healing. The farmhouse buzzed with the kind of comfortable activity that spoke of a home truly lived in. Rose had moved her belongings into Mary's old sewing room, transforming it into a cozy space that honored the past while embracing the present. Harold had claimed the small apartment above the barn, declaring it perfect for an old man who liked his privacy but didn't want to be too far from the action. The sound of vehicles approaching made Joe look up from the irrigation line he'd been adjusting. A steady stream of cars and trucks was making its way up the dirt road, more than he'd ever seen at one time. Today was the grand opening of what the town newspaper had dubbed Mackenzie Family Farm, and it seemed like half of Cedar Falls had decided to attend. Tom Morrison climbed out of his pickup truck, followed by Martha Kowalski, carrying what looked like enough food to feed an army. Sarah Chen emerged from her SUV with a group of veterinary students from the state university who'd driven up to see the organic farming operation everyone was talking about. Even Sheriff Patterson was there, out of uniform and grinning as his grandchildren raced toward the pasture where Rose had set up a small petting zoo with friendly goats and chickens. "Joe," Tom called out, walking over with obvious pride. "Have you seen the article in the Denver paper? They're calling your farm a model for sustainable agriculture and rural renewal. You're famous." Joe chuckled, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the support. "It's not about fame, Tom. It's about doing the work that needs doing and taking care of the land. And taking care of people too," Martha added, bustling over with a covered dish. "I brought my famous potato salad for the potluck, and I heard that restaurant in Millfield wants to buy all your herbs and specialty vegetables. That's wonderful news." It was wonderful news. The farmers' market had exceeded every expectation, with customers driving from 3 counties away to buy the organic produce grown on the farm where a father's love had triumphed over corporate greed. The story had spread through farming communities and urban markets alike, creating demand that kept Joe busy from dawn to dusk and brought in enough income to make the farm genuinely profitable for the first time in decades. Jenny Walsh arrived with her husband and 2 young children, who immediately ran off to join the other kids exploring the farm. She looked relaxed and happy, a far cry from the fierce attorney who demolished Mountain Vista's fraudulent scheme. "Any word on the final sentencing?" Joe asked as she approached. "Victoria Sterling got 8 years federal prison for fraud and racketeering," Jenny reported with satisfaction. "Crane got 5 years, and they've been ordered to pay restitution to all the families they targeted. The money won't replace what people lost, but it's something." "What about the other properties they stole?" "Most are being returned to the original owners or their heirs. It'll take time to sort through all the fraudulent documentation, but justice is slow. The important thing is that Mountain Vista is finished, and their investors lost everything." As the afternoon wore on, Joe found himself moving through the crowd of visitors like a man in a dream. Children ran through the fields where Annie had once played. Families picnicked under the same apple trees where he'd pushed his daughter on a rope swing. The laughter and conversation that filled the farmyard created an atmosphere of joy and community that he'd thought was lost forever. Late in the afternoon, as the last visitors were preparing to leave, Joe found himself alone in Annie's room one final time. The treasure box still sat on her desk, but now it was joined by new treasures, photos from the farm's reopening. "Thank you" letters, from customers, and a drawing that one of Sheriff Patterson's grandchildren had made of the farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney. "We did it, baby girl," Joe whispered to the quiet room. "We saved our home, and I think we've built something here that would make you proud. It's not the same as having you with us, but it's good. It's really good." The evening air carried the sound of Rose and Harold discussing plans for next year's crops, their voices mixing with the familiar sounds of the farm, settling into nighttime quiet. Outside the window, the mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky, and the creek sang its ancient song of continuity and change. Joe picked up Annie's Father's Day letter one more time, reading the words that had once broken his heart, but now filled it with peace. "I hope I can live on this farm forever and ever." She could. In every seed planted with love, in every family that found joy in the land she'd called home, in every act of kindness that grew from the soil of loss and redemption. Annie Mackenzie would live on this farm forever, not as a memory of grief, but as a legacy of love that would nurture generations yet to come. The man who'd wandered into Cedar Falls as a broken drifter had finally found his way home. And home, Joe had learned, wasn't just a place you came from, it was a place you chose to build, one day at a time, with love and hope and the unshakable belief that even the deepest wounds could heal if you had the courage to let them. The farm would remember. The family would continue. And love, always love, would endure.